Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to the comfiest couch in the world. My wife hates this couch. I don't know why, but she does. But I love it. And since I'm stuck at home for the next couple of weeks, this is where we'll be when we're shooting our videos for student ministry. So thanks for taking a few minutes to watch. I hope that one day you'll get to enjoy the comforts of this couch like I do. But for the time being, we're gonna study scripture together this way. I hope that your time at home has given you what you need to grow in your relationship with God. And if your relationship was already in a good spot, then I hope that it's just gotten better as you've had more time to sit and pray and read a little more. I hope you're taking our challenge, our 3x3 challenge right now to read more and to pray more and to love more. And I think if you'll do that, a lot of good things are going to happen for you spiritually. As we get started today, what I want you to do is actually to pause this video. I want you to take a few minutes and pray and ask God to work in your heart to teach you through His Word today. And then I want you to go ahead on your own and read through Mark chapter 9. Once you've had a chance to do those two things, to pray and then read through that chapter, Mark chapter 9, unfreeze me and we'll get back to things here. So the story you just read deals with something called the Transfiguration. And it's one of the few times in Scripture where Jesus' godness, if you will, His glory and His power was seen in an unfiltered view. See, up to this point, Jesus had been walking around just like a regular guy, like you, like me. Matter of fact, the Bible even says that He wasn't even that great to look at. He was just kind of an average kind of a looking guy. And so at this moment, when you started in verse number 2 and read through verse number 13, you have this situation where they go up on this mountain with just a handful of the disciples, and Jesus changes what He looks like from His mortal form, His human form, to His God form. And in that, He's got this radiant glory that shines. Moses and Elijah are there speaking with Him. Now, we understand that both of those guys are dead. But they're not dead because Jesus does this thing called resurrection, which is pretty cool. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But these guys are there, and I think the whole point of them being there was that both of these men had tried to point people back towards God in much the same way that Jesus was doing. Both Moses and Elijah's job was to help people meet God. And that's exactly why Jesus came, was to restore that relationship that was broken at the beginning of time between people and God. And so as we think about that this day, as we look at this, it's really important for us to understand that this is one shot where Jesus kind of pulls that back the curtain and says, hey, this is who I really am. Now, when He does that, Peter just kind of starts talking. He doesn't really know what to do. And I don't know if you've ever been in a situation like that, but Peter begins to kind of freak out a little bit. And he says in verse number 5, he asks, he's like, hey, can we build tents for you? Can we make a spot so we can stay here and enjoy this? And that really wasn't what God wanted them to do. They wanted the disciples to see kind of what was happening. They wanted them just to shut up and listen. And so as they get done with this, they start heading back down the mountain, and Jesus begins to talk about the fact that He's going to rise again from the dead. Now, they've just seen two people that were dead that are not anymore. The disciples don't get it, and they get kind of hung up on that statement. And Jesus at that point then in verse number 12 begins to tell them, He goes, yeah, He's like, I'm going to be mistreated. They mistreated Elijah. They mistreated Moses. Things are not going to go well for me. And they begin to ponder this. Again, in verse 30, 31, and 32, when you get later in this passage, Jesus makes statements like, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill Him. And when He is killed, after 3 days He will rise. But verse 32 says, but the disciples, it's talking about them, they didn't understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask Him. They didn't get it. Now, here's people that have been following Jesus around for the last couple of years. And he's speaking very plainly. I mean, there's no bones about it. He just kind of says, hey, things are not going to go well. He says in verse number 12, how is it written the Son of Man should suffer many things and be treated with contempt? Like, he doesn't mix his words here. Or in verse 31, when he says, I'm going to be killed, but I will rise from the dead, he's not playing around with things. It's a very clear, plain statement. And in both situations, Jesus does this, but His disciples don't understand it. And I wonder for us, would we have done any better? If it had been you and I following Jesus instead of guys like Peter and James and John, when He began to say things like this, and have we witnessed things like His glory, or witnessed people like Moses or Elijah walking around, would we have approached it any differently? Would we have thought any differently? I think that Jesus has already been pretty plain with us, just like he was with the disciples. He says things like, you're going to have trouble. You will be disliked. He even makes a statement a couple times that you will die. But he was also pretty plain and straightforward about the benefit and rewards that come with that kind of living, and that's the kind of living that requires that we follow him. He makes statements like, whoever loses his life will find it. He promises things like resurrection from the dead, which is a pretty big deal. He talks about things like a relationship with God and the opportunity to live in a world in the future where there is no such thing as COVID-19. You ever stop and think about that for a little bit? That Revelation tells us that when Jesus comes back again, he's going to remake the heavens and the earth. And when he does that, there won't be any longer any curse of sin, which is what we have right now. It's a disease. It's part of the curse of sin. In that, we have forgiveness of sins. We get a fresh start. There's lots of things that come as this relationship with Jesus progresses. And I want us to think about that as we look at this passage and as we ponder what Jesus says here. And he speaks very plainly, telling his disciples, this is exactly what's going to happen. I think that most of following Jesus is really not that complicated. I think that he lays out exactly for us what he wants us to be. I think that the hard part is we just have to do it. I don't know, I've said this before, there's billions of books that have been written about Christianity. I mean, billions of them. And if you think about it, Christianity as we know it has existed in some form since this time of Christ, which was roughly 2,000 years ago. So you've got all of this history and all of these people that have come over the centuries that have tried to interpret what Jesus said. And I wonder if sometimes Jesus doesn't just expect us just to listen to what he said and just do it. So starting in verse number 14, we've got this story with the boy, and he has a demon. And it's a pretty big deal. They come down from the mountain, Jesus and his disciples, and they get to the bottom, and there's a crowd there. They're watching the disciples. They're watching the religious people. There's this man with his son who's got a demon, and everybody's arguing. They're fighting, and they're struggling. And Jesus walks up to the crowd and says, hey, what are you doing? What's your problem? Like, what's happening here? And so they begin to lay it out for them. And Jesus comes up, and he finds out what's happening. And then he makes a statement in verse number 19. He says, "O faithless generation, how long am I to be with you? How long am I to bear with you? Bring him to me." See, the very first point where Jesus stops here is this idea of faith, that you haven't had enough faith in order to see this through. Is why haven't you believed enough? Bring him over here. And so they bring the boy over. He has this conversation with his dad and asks how long, and dad kind of describes what's happening in verses 20, 21, and 22. And then the dad makes a statement, and Jesus kind of gets his honest case for it a little bit. In verse 22, it says, "It is often cast him into fire and into water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." And Jesus said to him, "If you can, all things are possible for one who believes." Jesus kind of scoffs at that idea that he can't. And I think sometimes that we forget that there aren't things that Jesus can't do. And even though the disciples, and even though the religious people, and even though the dad and I'm sure he tried medicine and stuff like that, even with all the things that were happening here, these people were incapable of fixing this problem. But this was not an issue for Jesus. And he kind of, I don't know, if you read different translations phrase it different ways, but in verse 23 says, "If you can," my ESV has an exclamation point there. Like, really? If I can? Like, of course I can. It wasn't a matter of power. It was a matter of belief. And you see that right here. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said, "I believe, help my unbelief." He needed Jesus to help him understand what was happening. And so when you think about this whole story, this man, these disciples, these religious people, this crowd, they all needed faith in order to deal with their problem. They all had to believe that God could fix it before he was going to do anything about it. And I think the same thing applies to us. That before God is going to do anything in our life, before he's going to change anything at all, we have to believe that he can. I've said before over and over and over again that faith breeds action. In other words, when you believe something is when it takes place, is when it does. And that's how it works in our relationship with God. If you look at the rest of the story, he commands the demon to come out of him, and it does. And when you get into verse 28, they go into this house, and his disciples begin to ask him. They say, "Why couldn't we cast it out?" See, the disciples had already been doing this. They'd already been traveling around. They'd already been throwing out demons. They'd already been doing the exact things that Jesus wanted them to do. But in this situation, they didn't. They weren't able to. They did what they were supposed to do. It didn't happen. And Jesus' response, he said, this kind cannot be driven out by anything but prayer. What is prayer? A lot of times we think prayer is just asking God for things. Well, that's true. In some respects it is. But prayer ultimately is a recognition of who God is. It's the matter of going before Him and admitting the fact that we can't handle life on our own, and admitting that He's more powerful, more stronger. That's really great English, right? More stronger. He's better than we are in everything. And it's understanding that, submitting to that, and then allowing Him to work in us. It's believing that He's going to do something even before He's done it. And when you look at this, in this situation, prayer was the proper response. Now we look at our time right now, and there's a lot of crazy things happening, right? Some of you, maybe your parents are out of work right now. And I understand that if that's the case, I'm sorry. That's going to stink. And maybe there's people, loved ones that are close to you that either are at really high risk of getting this disease or have gotten it. I know that we've been starting to see some deaths in our area from this, and that can be a scary thing if that's you. Maybe you're just bored and you're stuck at home and you just don't feel a way out, and it looks like the end is not going to be in sight. I promise you it will at some point. Your parents are going to make you live in the backyard or something. But either way, in every single one of those situations, prayer is the proper response. Prayer is the point at which we come before God and we say, hey, I can't do this. I need help. This is why I asked you for our 3x3 challenge to begin to pray more, because it's not something we do enough. When you get to this whole situation, it didn't matter that the people were close to Jesus, like the disciples were. It didn't matter that they knew the Bible really well, like the scribes and the Pharisees did. It didn't matter that this dad loved his son as much as he possibly could. What mattered was they didn't believe that God could fix the situation. That's what mattered. And so for us, regardless of the situation, it matters what we believe God is capable of doing, and we begin to pray in respect to that. The last set of verses here from 33 to 50 are three kind of sub-stories or points that Jesus makes, if you will. And they're this, just to summarize them. The first one is in verses 33 through 37. It says, if you want to be great, you've got to serve others by putting their needs above your own. He makes that statement literally. He says, if anyone will be first, in verse 35, he must be last of all and servant of all. So if you want to be great, you've got to put service and the needs of others ahead of your own. That's number one. The second part of this is in verses 38 through 41. Basically, they have the situation where somebody else was throwing out demons, and the disciples walked up to him and like, hey, you're not part of our little group here. You're not part of the holy huddle, so to speak, and you need to stop that. You're not one of Jesus' disciples. And they go back and they tell Jesus, like, hey, somebody else was trying to do what we do, and that's not cool, right? And Jesus says, do not stop him. For no one who does a mighty work in my name will be able soon afterward to speak evil of me. For the one who is not against us is for us. For truly I say to you, whoever gives a cup of water to drink because you belong to Christ will by no means lose his reward. And my point that I wanted to make from that is that it doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. What matters is if they're following Christ. It doesn't matter what everybody else is doing. So stop worrying about them and just worry about yourself. It's important about your relationship with God. It's important about how you serve. It's important about how you do the things that you know that God has called you to do. And you don't need to worry about how everybody else is serving the master. Just worry about yourself and take care of you. If they aren't against you, leave them alone. Okay? If they're not hurting you, then just let them do their thing. They will answer to God for their actions. You will answer to God for yours. So let that be just something you think about. And the last part of this chapter in verses 42 through 50 talks about sin. First of all, talking about how we shouldn't be causing other people to sin, specifically those that are weaker than us, those who might look up to us. He uses the example of children in verse 42, and that's a pretty scary thing when you think about that. But then if you look at the rest of this passage, he basically uses this metaphor. Basically, if your hand causes you to sin, he says, cut it off. Now, he's not speaking literally there, but what he is getting at is that you need to ruthlessly tear sin out of your life. I don't know about you. I dabble in my garden, right? And I got this, I've been working in it a little bit the last couple of days, but I got this vine that grows up on my stuff. And if I sound like a nerd, I'm sorry. But those of you who like to play in the dirt, you'll understand. So anyway, I get my plants going. I'm really happy. Got my corn growing. Corn's a beautiful thing. I love corn. you get these little vines that come up and they start wrapping around. And the problem is those suckers run deep. I mean, they get super deep in the ground. They're really hard to get out. And there's been times when I've literally like just bought a thing of weed killer and gone in and sprayed my whole garden to kill everything off to get it out. There's times where I've destroyed good plants to get that weed out of there. There's all sorts of things that I've done because I hate this vine. And the reality is we have to treat sin the same way. We have to tear it out wherever it comes. Now, I don't want any of you gouging your eyes out because you're looking at things you shouldn't be able to do. And I don't want anybody like cutting off your hand. Again, this is a metaphor of what's happening here. Jesus expects you to ruthlessly tear sin out of your life. He goes on to the very end. He says in verse 49, everyone will be salted with fire. Salt is good, but if the salt has lost its saltiness, how will you make it salty again? You may be looking at that like, why the heck does Jesus care about salt? Well, here's the deal. Salt destroys impurities. Back in the old days, they would pack meat. Maybe you've been to Greenfield Village and you've seen the meat hanging in some of the farmhouses where it's been packed in salt. It keeps things, it preserves things, it keeps things from rotting. And the same thing, like it's really painful, but if you get a cut or a bruise or something like that, salt can be used to keep infection from starting. It's incredibly painful. Incredibly painful if you've ever gotten salt on a cut or something. And what he's getting at there right there is that you need to salt yourself. You need to keep those impurities out of your life. You need to do something that's going to preserve yourself. You need to be like salt. And in that, you need to love others. He says that right at the very end. It says, have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another. You need to take care of other people. See, here's the deal. I don't think it's complicated to follow Jesus. I just think that we have to do it. I think it involves listening, which is why I asked you to start reading the book of Mark. We're in Mark chapter 9. If you're on par, by the time you're watching this, you should be in right about Mark 14 or 15. So if you need to catch up, try to get to that point by the end of the day on Sunday, whenever we are taking a look at this. But you've got to listen to what Jesus says if you're going to do it. And so that it means reading, listening to whatever that looks like for you. The second part, I think, is it means realizing that you can't do this on your own, that you need help, which is why I've asked you to pray. That's the second part of our challenge. I've asked you to pray more because you can't do it on your own. You need some help. I know some of you are macho guys. You think you can handle it, and yeah, good luck with that. The last part of this, I think it means declaring war on the sin in your life. You're home right now, right? You've been home for several weeks now. You've got several more weeks ahead of you, and depending on how your schools go, you may even be out for the rest of the summer, which means you've got more free time on your hands than you're used to. And for some of you already, that's already caused you some problems. And so let me challenge you. Let me beg you to begin to make war on that sin. Take action against it. Start working to fight it. Root it out. Change your lifestyle if you have to, but don't be a slave to it. If there's a time of your day where you know, hey, I'm going to be tempted to do this, I don't know, go for a walk, get outside, go do something, learn a new instrument or a language or something. I don't know, do something productive. Jesus is there with all of the power and all of the authority of God inside of him. He revealed that to his disciples on the side of that mountain. He's in heaven right now, seated on the right hand of God, and he's doing the things that are going to bring his kingdom about. But he has all of that power and authority behind him, and you've got to recognize that fact and listen to him and listen to what he's saying. I am hoping over the next few weeks to go through more of the book of Mark with you. We're going to be doing that on Sundays. On Wednesdays, we're going to keep our progression going through Exodus, and hopefully in a few weeks we'll be back together again. So I want to say thanks for watching. We'd love for you to comment on our videos, share what God's doing in your life. That would be amazing if you can do that. Don't be afraid. I want to hear from you, so please do that. I'll plan to see you Wednesday, and we'll go through some more stuff. So keep tabs on our Instagram, keep tabs on our YouTube and our Facebook page. Again, I know none of you use Facebook, but I don't know, show your grandma or something. But we're excited to be hanging out this way together. So talk to us, let us know you're still alive, and don't eat all of the food in your house just yet. See ya.